Hello friends, we're continuing our walk through 1 Timothy, busy with 1 Timothy chapter 2 verses 11 to 15. And today we're at the epicenter of the storm, namely 1 Timothy 2 verse 12. I'm going to look at 12 to 14 together. What I'm trying to show you is that we are dealing with a really difficult ancient text, and that there are many things we simply do not know and cannot conclude with certainty. Therefore, we should be very careful using this passage as a doctrinal foundation for major decisions. Broadly speaking, there are two entrenched camps. The complementarian camp, which would tend to see the restrictions in this text as permanent, as normative, and the egalitarian camp, which would see them as contextual and temporary, limited to a specific situation in that time and context. However, within both groups, there are significant differences. Why? Because there are many difficult questions embedded within the text, and I'm just going to give you a sample of them today. So without further ado, let's go and have a look at verses 12 through 14. Here is 1 Timothy 2 verse 12 in the ESV. It says, "I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet." So what are some of the difficulties in this particular passage? Let's start with this phrase, I do not permit. So, I do not permit. So, do not permit. The first question we should ask is, why does Paul not use an imperative? So, in verse 11, he uses an imperative when he says, let a woman learn. In Greek, it's an imperative. English doesn't have a third person imperative. So it's a command. This is an indicative. I do not permit. He doesn't say do not permit. He says I do not permit. So why not an imperative verb? When we speak in the language of permission, so I permit, I do not permit, embedded in the language of permission is jurisdiction. So I can say to my son, I don't permit you to do something. But I can't say to your son, I don't permit you to do something. Why? Because I don't have jurisdiction over your son. So when Paul says, I do not permit, what are the limits of his jurisdiction? We might ask, did other apostles permit things that Paul didn't permit? If indeed we're talking in the language of permanent rules. So are there limits to the jurisdiction of I permit and I do not permit? Another question is that the Greek sentence can be translated equally plausibly, I am not permitting, as if referring to something that has a limited expiry date, if you wish. And we can translate it, I do not permit or I am not permitting. Both of them equally plausible translations of the Greek. Which one did Paul mean? The more lasting sense of I don't permit something as more of a settled principle, or I am not permitting something as what's going on at the moment? Once again, we do not know. And then lastly, does I do not permit, does I, where Paul's speaking about himself, equate to saying God does not permit? In other words, is this Paul's principle, which may not have been shared by other ministers and apostles? We generally take it as Paul's opinion and principle because of his stature, equating to God's will. But should we? So lots of questions around I do not permit. The next phrase we have is a woman. And again, as in the previous verse, does the Greek word gineia mean a woman or does it mean a wife? And of course, for man over here, does that refer to a husband or to any man? So is Paul talking about no woman having any kind of authority over any man, or is it talking within the confines of a husband and wife type relationship? So that's a question, right? And we can, again, swing both ways on that. Our next key point here is he says, I do not permit a woman to teach, didaskin in Greek. So we've got this idea of to teach. And we need to ask a few things. Where? So where is this teaching happening? Is it specifically limited to a gathered worship service of the corporate church? This is widely assumed, but there's almost nothing in 1 Timothy chapter 2 or 3 that imposes that restriction. So we seem to bring that filter to the text. But it makes a huge difference to how we read the text. Is Paul talking specifically about what is permitted for a woman to do in the gathered corporate church service? Maybe, maybe not. The next question we need to ask is, does he mean this word teach in a positive sense or in a negative sense? So some of the egalitarian theories would hold that he is denouncing the right of women shouldn't teach false teaching. They shouldn't teach heresy. But again, there are huge problems with it being negative, right? Because why would he restrict not teaching heresy to women? And why would he restrict that to women teaching men heresy? So to some extent, that doesn't make entire sense. In complementarian circles, they tend to take this teaching as referring specifically to authoritative teaching of doctrine. And the idea becomes that there are two types of teaching. There's non-authoritative teaching and there's authoritative teaching. Because it's clear that in some of Paul's other correspondence, women would teach, would share, would prophesy. So he clearly allowed women to teach in certain circles. And so the argument is, he's referring to a specific category of teaching, authoritative teaching. But there's nothing in any of Paul's letters that indicates that he has two categories of teaching, one authoritative and one not. We have to impose it onto this particular text. Our next question concerns the words to exercise authority, because these words to exercise authority could also mean to usurp authority. And the word is only used once in the New Testament and seemingly wasn't used before in biblical Greek. I hope that's a true statement. I haven't verified that recently. Anyhow, sometimes avthentin, which is the word, has the idea of exercising legitimate authority, and sometimes it means usurping or assuming authority that you're not supposed to assume. And there's a huge battleground as to whether this word is the positive sense of exercising legitimate authority, which would be the complementarian view, or in a negative sense of usurping or taking authority you're not supposed to have, which generally would be the egalitarian view. So if it's positive, meaning exercising authority, the next question becomes, does it refer to pastoring? So does to teach or to exercise authority, is that code for saying to occupy the office of an overseer or a pastor? That is widely how it's interpreted and applied, and therefore this text becomes an argument for women not being able to occupy the office of a pastor or an overseer. There may be other arguments, but this one's often brought to bear. There is a problem, though. The word avthentin, nowhere in about 80 references, nowhere ever refers specifically to the authority wielded legitimately by a church leader. So that this would, again, be the only place where that's its sense. Therefore, how can we use that to base our theology of who's allowed to be an elder or a pastor? Maybe dubious. If it's negative, what's the connection between teaching and authority? How are these two connected? A lot of people take them as one idea, to teach authoritatively from the office of an elder. The Greek text, I think, wages against that, and it doesn't really fit the argument. Lastly, we have, she is to remain quiet. And if we're not talking about a church setting, if we're talking about general life setting, why would a woman need to remain quiet? If there isn't some kind of a formal setting, a problem perhaps for that view. So what you should see here, and I'm only scratching the surface, is that there are lots and lots of questions. And for most of these questions, there are plausible answers that can go in more than one direction. Let's move on to verses 13 and 14. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. That's the end of verse 13. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. So we start with this word for. And our first question as we approach this is, what is for introducing? The general complementarian answer is that it's introducing the theological grounds that proscribe women from teaching or exercising authority, and that because it seems to give that by rooting it in a biblical principle, Paul must be talking about something permanent, normative. The egalitarian view tends to say he's giving a supporting illustration. So he's using a story from the Old Testament to illustrate something. And the question then becomes, well, what is he illustrating? But actually, how the statement that follows relates to what goes before is a bit of a problem for all interpretive views. Adam was formed first, then Eve. So that's our statement. So we got one Adam and two Eve. This was the order of creation. So what is his point? Is Paul, in a very shorthand and cryptic way, arguing that the fact that Adam was formed first and then Eve, is he trying to say that Genesis 2 about creation establishes a normative order of male headship and leadership that is permanently binding on humanity? And that's a common interpretation within the complementarian view and is often taken as being the conclusive argument for the complementarian view, that it's grounded in this creation order. Right, so if it's a creation order, if we concede that point, if it's a creation order, so this is the complementarian view, then we have another really critical question. If Genesis 2 teaches that men should lead and women should not lead over men, how do you ever limit that? Why would you ever limit that to home and church life? On what grounds do we say that this applies to the home and to the church, but it doesn't apply to the business world, it doesn't apply to the secular realm, it only applies in the church? And a huge problem here for the complementarian argument is there is no sound way that you can limit this application to saying it proscribes women having authority over men in church and home, but not in the rest of society. It creates this huge inconsistency. Doesn't it make strange reading for Paul to be saying in the church, which is the only place where humankind is redeemed by the same salvation and indwelt by the same Spirit who distributes gifts to male and female alike, that this is the only sector of society where women should never be allowed to lead men or teach them? So that's a dilemma. A popular view amongst the egalitarians is that he might be correcting a myth. So we know that the false teaching had a lot to do with myths and genealogies. Was one of the myths a mythical interpretation of Genesis 2? Well, maybe not, but we have no hard evidence to suggest that it was. It's essentially pure guesswork, isn't it? Let's move on to verse 14. He talks about the fact that Adam was not deceived, but Eve was deceived. And once again, we ask the question, what is his point? And how does saying Adam was not deceived and Eve was deceived, how does that support the claim made in verse 12? Is he talking about ontology, meaning the inherent nature of men and women? If so, is he claiming that women are inherently more vulnerable to temptation than men because they are like Eve and men are like Adam? Well, the rest of Scripture, I think, raises big questions about whether his point could be that there's an ontological superiority. Men have a high capacity for being deceived and deceivers as well. And in the context of Ephesus, there's not much doubt that the primary deceivers were male false teachers. Another common view advanced within the egalitarian circles mostly was that he's talking about the fact that women are not educated. So they're not allowed to teach while they are not well educated because they'll be more vulnerable to deception. And there too, there are some contextual problems. And if that's his point, why not specify that limitation? Why not indicate that it's related to this period of time while they are being encouraged to learn? And one more question, what about context? Is this a contextual question? If the problem is false teaching, so one of the views says, yeah, he's saying women mustn't teach because those specific women were spreading false teaching in the church. But if the problem is that there's a specific group of women in that church at that time that are spreading false teaching, why would Paul say that they mustn't teach men only? Surely they also shouldn't be teaching their false teaching to women. And in the context of the church, we know that many of the false teachers were men. So why isn't he placing a restriction on them and making clear that he's talking about something pretty concrete? So that's a mouthful probably, right? There's just a barrage of difficult questions coming at us when we read this passage. And many of them can go in more than two directions. And what might shock you is that we've only scratched the surface. There are many, many more questions. And they're real and deep questions, so much so that honest scholars readily admit that 1 Timothy 2 verses 12 to 14 is a difficult passage. Sometimes the uninformed will say, I think naively, that their church practice simply reflects the clear teaching of 1 Timothy 2 verses 11 through 15. In other words, they read it, they assume that, and they assume it from translation, right? The translation is already an interpretation. The ESV is inherently complementarian in its translation. So they read it in their translation, think this makes perfect clear sense, and they go and apply it, and they say, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that there are very significant interpretive difficulties in 1 Timothy 2 verses 11 to 14. And so my question is, can we base major decisions, doctrines, practices on a passage where there are so many uncertainties and where the battle lines between the red team and the blue team are so firmly demarcated? But even within those camps, there are huge variations, and almost every detail is contentious. My point, of course, is that we should be very careful basing our doctrine and practice on such a difficult and controversial text. I hope that's helpful. As always, if you found it helpful, drop me a like or a subscribe. Love to hear from you on this one in the comments below. What do you make of some of these questions? What do you make of the common claim that the text is just pretty clear? What's the problem? So let me know and have a wonderful day.